Good afternoon. Thanks for joining the Skill Me Up expert talk on landing zones. So, my name is Shannon Kuehn, and I am a senior cloud advocate on the Enterprise Platforms and Tools team. I work with the broader community to help IT pros feel comfortable with what a migration pattern looks like, what digital transformation looks like for each company. And then in the last 5 years, I've been pretty much all cloud. So the idea here is I'm becoming less and less akin to touching, racking, stacking servers and more akin to what developers tend to do by hitting REST APIs and dealing with those types of topics. So that's what I do in terms of my day-to-day.
And I'm Dwayne Natwick. I am a cloud training architect lead for Opsagility and Skill Me Up, where I author content, provide training, and I am also a Microsoft certified trainer and a regional lead for that program. You can find me on many of the social media links provided on this slide. Feel free to reach out. And I'm also a Microsoft MVP for Azure. So as we have continued, and Shannon and I have talked in the episodes leading up to today, we have been covering, some good practices and best practices around architecting and moving into an Azure environment. Today, we're going to focus on landing zones and what are landing zones and enterprise scales, some of the design principles for building your architecture with landing zones, design guidelines, how to utilize the implementation guide for creating your first landing zones, and then some resources and next steps that will be helpful for you as you continue down your path to adoption.
So we'll start with what is enterprise scale. So enterprise scale is an architecture approach and reference implementation that enables effective construction and operationalization of landing zones in Azure. So this helps you kind of align with the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure, right? It'll represent the strategic design path and target technical state for your Azure environment. It continues to evolve over time along with the Azure platform, much like the Cloud Adoption Framework, as well as the well-architected framework. It's defined by various design decisions that your organization essentially makes prior to starting in on your Azure journey. And that's everything leading up to landing zones. So that's the Cloud Adoption Framework, taking a workload and figuring out what we could do related to the well-architected framework. So not all enterprises adopt Azure in the same way. So, you can think about the Cloud Adoption Framework for enterprise scale landing zone architectures in various different ways. So, technical observations and design recommendations, they might lead to different trade-offs as you embrace the Azure platform. So certain things might not be ready for what you would be hopeful for. Other things might be a little bit too advanced from where you are right now. The beauty is this is another sort of framework, sort of guided approach here to take into consideration what it would mean to bring you into the world of Azure. So the approach is authoritative. It provides a holistic design framework for the Azure platform. It's proven as it's really based on the successes of many large-scale migration projects. It's also pretty prescriptive as well. So it's made up of design principles, design guidelines, implementation guidelines, and then you take that where it needs to go related to your Azure environments. So you'll take a look at network, security, identity, etc. And then you'll build out a landing zone, which is where you'll take that reference implementation of a workload environment that conforms to the enterprise scale guidance. So the principal purpose of a landing zone is really to ensure that when an application or workload lands in Azure, the required plumbing is already in place. This will provide greater agility and compliance with enterprise security and governance requirements.
So let's now talk about some of the design principles that go into that enterprise scale plumbing, as Shannon was just mentioning. So some key things around the enterprise design principles is what we're looking at in terms of creating that enterprise scale is that we are enabling autonomy and allowing innovation among how we're going about our cloud transformation. We're building in security and compliance by default, and we are providing at scale governance that can be sustainable amongst our cloud engineering group. And that can be handled with many different ways in terms of, you know, how we're using our subscription. We're driving governance with policy. We're providing those control management planes within our environment, and we're providing application-centric and neutrality in our archetypes as we build that then Azure native design and platform roadmap. So let's talk about each of those a little bit more. So subscription democratization, we're looking at how we're utilizing that subscription as the single unit of management and how we're aligning that and scaling that with the business needs and our priorities and supporting our areas of business within that subscription and the different owners to accelerate how those applications are going to migrate and how you're going to develop new applications in there. And if we manage those within that subscription, then we can then take each of those pieces and parts within a portfolio or a solution or an application and very easily just drop that into the specific landing zones at an enterprise level. The policy-driven governance, obviously, a key thing around Azure policy is how it governs both your cost and your security and your resources within the environment. And utilizing Azure policy provides then those guardrails and the continued compliance of your platform, as well as auditable compliance for currently existing workloads within the cloud environment. And as you deploy additional platforms and applications within the environment, those Azure policies then can provide the security that can create that freedom and unhindered a path to the cloud, but also maintain the security and compliance that your organization and your enterprise needs. From a standpoint of providing that single control plane, using an enterprise scale architecture can still provide those abstraction layers and how and provide customer developed portals and tooling that can be utilized for application operations, for centrally managed op teams, as well as development and DevOps for dedicated application operations teams. And those can be segmented within that enterprise scale for utilizing those policies, utilizing the frameworks that you put in place. When we start talking about then application-centric migrations and developing those rather than pure infrastructure lift and shift migrations, now we're starting to differentiate the old and the new. And we're now looking at how we're transforming our environments and how we're now taking the infrastructure as a service and platform as a service type applications, and we are utilizing those at the full scale and the full capabilities that are available. And finally, now that we have gone through and we've built built upon our building blocks of our design principles, now we have hopefully a Azure native design and a platform roadmap that can align to your enterprise architecture. We're approaching now and we're utilizing native platform services and capabilities wherever possible. And now we have those aligned with the Azure platform roadmaps to ensure that new capabilities are made available as they become available within the customer environments. So now we've provided our flexibility and our ability to now scale and leverage Azure to its fullest extent. So I think, Shannon, now you're going to talk about the design guidelines around building an enterprise scale environment.
Sure, yeah. So let's start with defining the Azure Active Directory tenants. So we've got a concept here of an enterprise agreement. That enrollment represents the commercial relationship between Microsoft and how your organization uses Azure. It provides the basis for billing across all your subscriptions and affects administration of your digital estate. So your EA enrollment is managed via an Azure Enterprise portal, and an enrollment often represents an organization's hierarchy, which includes departments, accounts, and subscriptions. When you're thinking about how to plot this out, there's a number of administrator roles that you actually can, I guess, provision or assign out the gate. There's the enterprise administrator, the department administrator, the account owner, the service administrator, the notification contact. These are big roles that are important related to managing and maintaining your enterprise agreement. Keep in mind as well, an Azure Active Directory tenant provides identity and access management. So these are the enterprise agreement roles. Azure Active Directory has a series of roles as well that you can ensure authenticated and authorized users have access to only the things you need them to have access to. So there's this idea here of a really comprehensive RBAC model that you can put into play related to Azure Active Directory. So the enterprise enrollment roles link users with their functional roles, and that's really the enterprise administrator, department administrator. But then when you go into Azure, you have capacity to assign a different roles based upon what your users are doing. So you can think about virtual machine contributor, SQL contributor, right? So maybe you don't want them to have full-blown access into everything in the portal. You can really restrict what you're doing related to the comprehensive sort of IAM strategy related to how you put this together. So stemming forward from the identity and access management components here, see, the critical design consideration is figuring out if you need to extend an on-premises identity domain into Azure, or if you're going to create a brand new one and maybe have some sort of forest trust between on-premises and Azure. I'll tell you, most of the customers I've worked with over the years, they choose the very first example. The very, heavily security-minded folks are a little bit more in the minority, but I have seen customers build out a brand new forest inside Azure that trusts on premises environments. So you want to really think through what makes the most sense related to your IAM strategy, right? So a lot of enterprises will follow the least privileged approach to operational access. So this model really should be, expanded to consider Azure through Azure Active Directory, the RBAC controls, custom role definitions, as well as how do we take into consideration existing users' accounts, any sort of service accounts, et cetera, inside Active Directory. Some of the management components here, so you can think about the management group itself. So the management group structure, think of it kind of sitting in close proximity to Azure Active Directory. It's a step above most of Azure. So you can use the management group structure within the AAD tenant to support org mapping. So you can divide things up into business units. You can divide them up into specific user roles, if that makes sense, right? You have to think about what you actually provision related to Azure adoption at scale. So you want to be able to provision those management groups, so it's kind of a set it and forget it sort of thing. So these are really important conversations to have. You'll want to think about platform limits and quotas related to the Azure platform for services. So you want to think about not having 250 storage accounts in one subscription, because that's one limit I can think of off the top of my head. You want to plot those out, and there's a fantastic link that I actually don't think is in this PowerPoint deck, but it's the subscription limits and quotas per Azure resource. Now, usually the limits themselves are pretty vast, but sometimes you get into weird situations where you hit those limits. So one of the things to be conscious of as you're plotting out this actual landing zone where workloads and future workloads will migrate to or be built on, you want to factor in those types of things, as well as the availability of SKUs if you need a specific VM, a specific region, a specific type of, say, Azure, maybe Azure Cosmos DB, maybe a certain SKU of Azure SQL. You want to make sure all of that's available in the region you're deploying everything to. So subscription quotas, they're not really capacity guarantees, and they are per region. So there's this concept here of a soft limit and a hard limit. A lot of that's outlined in the document I had referenced. So maybe that's one of the things, Dwayne, we can work on trying to get that to everybody that consumes this video, just to be aware of it, right? I often would lead with that with some of these conversations with customers, just because of the fact that people think of the cloud as infinite and vast, and for the most part it is. But there are times where you might need to think about a quota increase. From there, I think you recall the big cost management discussion we had last week. So, you'll need to figure out a chargeback model. You'll want to figure out how to bill PaaS resources that might be shared. You might have an app service environment that multiple people are leaning on. So you'll need to figure out the right way to share that between business units. And then you'll want to figure out, should we shut down certain VMs at certain times of the day, given the workflow on a day-to-day basis, right? So that'll help ease costs and keep costs low, as well as predictable. In terms of network topology and connectivity, so you'll want to plan for your IP addressing out the gate. That really, the recommendation is to not have the IP addresses overlap. So think of it like building out a brand new data center. You would probably pick a different IP address block, and then you would unify that by site to site, or in the case of Azure, it would be express route, right? So you would want to figure out the right CIDR notation for your address blocks, and Azure supports all of the three main class networks, right? So you don't have to worry about this becoming a completely foreign concept. It feels very similar to what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. You'll have to figure out where DNS is going to be configured from. So if you are stretching that network, and I always recommend doing that, especially if you are at that point of, we're so brand new to Azure, we're trying to figure out how to make use of it. You'll want to make sure that your VNets in Azure can see where DNS is authoritative. So if your DNS is authoritative on premises, at least at first while you're building everything out, definitely point your DNS servers to the DNS servers on premises within the VNet. You want to figure out the network topology. A lot of customers pick the hub and spoke topology, meaning everything terminates to the hub from on premises and everything spokes out based upon workload, business unit, etc. Then you can think about leaning on Azure vWAN. So this is a Microsoft managed service that might make sense. Maybe it's something that you're not really sure about. So there's always opportunities to explore some of this as you're building it out kind of in mid-flight. Or you could think about the traditional Azure networking where you're building out a customer managed model where that does require you to pay attention to certain things like address overlap. This is the walkthrough to the right here. This is kind of the enterprise scale network topology. It's vWAN based. There's a similar topology that you're managing the IP address space. And then you want to figure out connectivity to Azure. So a lot of enterprise scale customers pick ExpressRoute because it's an easy way to think through a direct connection into Azure. Think of it like dark fiber into Azure, because that's what it is, right? But a lot of times people hear ExpressRoute and they don't really quite know what it is. It's your own dedicated dark fiber that you purchase from a telco provider and you connect up into your tenant. You'll want to configure private connectivity. That's just private peering. And then you'll want to configure Microsoft peering based upon the services that you consume that have public endpoints. From a management and monitoring perspective, so you'll think through, so Azure Monitor is a big piece of the monitoring tool set inside of Azure. Underneath sit the log analytics workspaces, as well as things like application insights. Application insights is something I won't really dig into that much. Just know your developers will be super familiar with that. It's the ways in which they'll collect telemetry for proprietary apps that they're building. The log analytics workspace, though, it's kind of a boundary, right, where you are able to view the logs that are being generated by Azure Monitor, and you can actually send logs to Log Analytics by way of different resources in Azure. So you can think about using that from a security and audit like logging perspective. You could think about building this approach where you've got that single pane of glass. You can think about building out dashboards. You can use workbooks. There's a lot of interesting things you can do to give yourself a lot more visibility than you normally have. Well, in theory, that you normally don't have on premises, right? You get all kinds of logs, and it's a matter of what do you want to extract to make the most use of your resources deployed in Azure. And then you'll want to figure out the Azure data retention thresholds because, and I can't remember off the top of my head, especially because this number does tend to change. Log Analytics only stores those logs for a finite period of time. If you need those logs longer, you'll want to figure out a retention policy. Maybe that's moving it to Event Hub to be ingested by something else. Maybe it's just moving it to a storage account. There's a number of different things you could think through, but you'll want to make sure you have this at least plotted out as you build your landing zone, because as soon as you start spinning up services, logs will be generated.
Aren't those logs only about 60 or 90 days for Log Analytics?
It is something like that.
I think it's a somewhat short time frame.
It is. Yeah, and I can never remember that. Like when I have the conversations with customers, I'm always like, let me go check, because I can't remember, but I think it's like 30 days or 90 days.
Yeah, I think it's a surprisingly short amount of time. You'd think that things would be held a little bit longer than that. It's always surprised me that when I see the log retention time frames.
Yeah, and I mean, the beauty is you can always extract those logs and save them long term based upon compliance requirements. So those tools do exist. But I guess if you think about what everything lives on, and it lives on Azure Data Explorer, which is a shared ginormous instance, essentially. I don't really quite know all of the architecture that's built out, but if it's shared and you kind of give these rules and guidelines to follow, much like the subscription limits and quotas, it conditions folks to think about, we can extract everything from this because it's really straightforward and simple, and move it somewhere else and store it for 2 years or 7 years or whatever you have to think about.
Yep. Data lifecycle management at its
best. And I mean, and it's weird too, because you add in other PaaS components and, like people can go in and they can extract data and view it periodically, and, you can store it. It's just, you have to really think about the ways in which your actual end users interact with Azure. So a lot of complexities there, especially when you think about some of the PaaS services. The next big component usually you want to think through is BCDR. So business continuity and disaster recovery is, I think, every sysadmin's, well, it's what we really strive to achieve. A lot of times customers don't really focus on your disaster recovery plans. They have something in place, but nobody ever tests it, right? Well, now you're in the cloud, or you're thinking about moving to the cloud. You have a little bit more flexibility on the ways in which you can think about moving yourself into Azure. So you don't necessarily have to be constrained based upon what you actually own and can physically fail over. Azure's infinite. Well, there are limits, but I mean, it really won't feel like those limits exist related to just a straight failover of mission critical workloads that might live on a VM, for instance, right? So you want to think about the ways in which to do that. The tool of choice, if you're leaning on the Azure Native Toolkit, is really to think about Azure Site Recovery. But there's also BCDR components for PaaS, right? So, there's native DR built into certain things like Cosmos DB. You can think about stitching together certain resources in Azure to give you that full comprehensive BCDR solution for PaaS resources. So PaaS is usually kind of version 2.0, maybe version 3.0 of what a digital transformation looks like, but you may want to start thinking about what it will take once you get to that point. You want to think through the support for multi-region deployments, and then, failover. That really helps your failover purposes, right? So if you are living in the SQL Server world and you've got an always-on availability group, you're stretching between 2 regions, you'll want to think about the asynchronous replication pattern, which region you want to pick to have kind of your failover node, right? And you want to think through those components as well, because that does factor in cost, because that VM will essentially be up and online and just accepting data asynchronously by way of your primary SQL servers on in your primary region. You want to think about application operations with reduced functionality or degraded performance. Sometimes there are problems in Azure, and you'll want to think through what happens when we get to that point. How will we be able to spin something up in a different region? And maybe it's one of those things where you're leaning on a backup. Maybe you're redeploying via infrastructure as code. The capacity here is pretty endless, but you want to make sure that your landing zones are there so that in the event that this service needs to come on, it needs to be reliant upon Active Directory controllers, those are there. You want to make sure that the site-to-site peering is configured. You want to make sure that everything looks and feels in a way that it can just be up and functional and know what it needs to do, the app itself. So you want to make sure that you're plotting this out as you think through your BCDR compliance and requirements surrounding that. In terms of compliance, so you'll want to figure out, like I said, those scale limits and subscription limits. They'll apply to things like Key Vault. So Key Vault will serve as that security boundary. It's a single access permission for keys, secrets, and certificates at kind of the vault level. So I work with customers who will deploy one in their primary region. All of their secrets will go there. And then what they'll do is they've got automation that will take those secrets and copy them to different regions. So in the event there's a regional failure, you've got capacity then to lean on your secrets and continue to operate as you normally function inside kind of your backup region, so to speak. The premium SKU can be leaned on. So there's HSM-backed security keys now. Customers can bring their own security keys into Azure. So if that's the case, you'll want to spin up an HSM. And I wish I knew more. I just know that it's a little bit of an involved process with our program group to do that, but it is possible, and you'll want to have HSMs in both regions just to make sure that you've got, the functionality there that you can spin things up and have your customer managed key there. Or you could just have an HSM in your on-premises environment and then store those keys into Key Vault as well. Whatever makes the most sense to you and your operational patterns. The dedicated HSM does come with a higher cost. So usually customers kind of come up with this compromise of, I'll generate the keys for my HSM and I'll store them in Key Vault, and then I'll replicate those keys to a different region by way of some like Azure function or trigger. So that's kind of a cool thing. But you'll want to make sure that you think through some key rotation capacity here as well. You don't want to have the same secret for years and years and years, right? The world is changing so much in this space. So you want to make sure that you've got an automated process for key and certificate rotation, that you're notified well in advance that the certificates are going to expire, because you don't want to have everything kind of come to a screeching halt. So these are things you'll want to think through as you build out the landing zones so that when your workload shows up, it kind of knows where it needs to go, it knows what it needs to do, and everybody's happy in theory, right? Fingers crossed. When we think about platform automation and DevOps, so where central teams are concerned, CI/CD pipelines should be used to kind of manage policy definitions, role definitions, policy assignments, and template galleries. So having that central repository becomes really important. Now we can go and we can redeploy environments very quickly. It's a matter of minutes versus months, potentially many months, right? So now we've got capacity to build things fairly quickly. And the idea here is to, kind of establish this DevOps team of sorts. If it's one of those things where you take people from existing teams and kind of have them be the ones that focus on the process, great. I often feel like if you name it a different team and they've got a different management group and whatnot, things sometimes don't work out as expected. So I've seen the better reality to be kind of pull people from infrastructure, pull people from app dev, from data platform, from security, and have them be the ones that work on ways in which to get DevOps kind of off the ground and functional. But you'll want to bring that approach into Azure, because if something were to fail, you would probably want to have something that spins everything up pretty quickly inside Azure with minimal downtime. So that cross-functional team is the kind of pulling people from different areas of the business. That'll help you continue to scale and move forward and build out the, kind of those muscles that you may not have known you needed, right? So you can think through the enterprise scale architecture on that front. So for some legacy applications, the application team may not have the engineering resources required to align with the DevOps strategy. So you have to factor in what it's going to take to get them up to that level. Maybe it's a little bit more manual to deploy some of those legacy apps, and that's something that DevOps team should hopefully have enough understanding to go in and come up with recommendations and best practices. Because if that's the first workload, because it's one of those workloads that's it's not terribly complex, but you want to make sure it's resilient, that might be something that requires a little bit more back and forth, because you want to make sure all of the components to have that application be up and functional are there once everything arrives in Azure.
All right, so let's talk about how we can now use some guidance into the enterprise scale. What do we have in terms of the ability to and the guidance that Microsoft provides for you to move in that direction. So the enterprise scale implementation guide is very helpful in terms of how to get started, and it builds on some things about what must be true, and then some ways now to start building those new regions and landing zones. And some of the things that must be true is that there needs to be an initial configuration established. There needs to be, there must be Azure and Azure Active Directory admins that are performing that configuration. We need to think about it in this sense that it, is initially one-off type activities, and then we start thinking of everything very sequentially, and start to then build those new landing zones. And those landing zones require the user input to start that workflow and to coordinate then the creation within Azure Active Directory, and in a hybrid architecture, the on-premises Active Directory. What are some of the reoccurring activities that need to take place? And then to operationalize at scale, we need to then have these activities follow the principles of infrastructure as code and utilizing automation through different deployment pipelines like ARM templates or GitHub repositories and the like. So now when we're thinking about the activities and policies, now what must be true within those? And that's looking at whether we're utilizing EA enrollments or we're utilizing Azure Active Directory tenants, or both of those. Are we utilizing, and then the management group and the subscription? Are we using global networking and connectivity? What is the security, governance, and compliance that we need to adhere to within our environment? And then how are we going to manage those platforms and monitor those platforms? We're going to use Azure Monitor. Are we going to use other third-party tools and capabilities as tied into the Azure environment as well? And then where we take that, then once we've identified those key areas, is then now we can start creating those subscriptions, creating those regions, connecting and securing our VNets, creating our VNets, protecting those across. If we're going to use, the virtual hubs, the vHub environments, assigning our owners and management groups, and how they're going to manage those environments. Are we going to utilize privileged identity management and those things? Setting up our budgets, alerts, and security, our security contacts. How are we going to monitor and govern and alert on that governance within our environment, and creating then our Azure Active Directory groups and provisioning our required services, and then assigning those policies to all of those to those resources that we have now created within the environment. And I think, Shannon, now you're going to discuss some references and how we can utilize those within the environment as well, right?
Definitely. I think the beauty here is we have a handful of nifty tools that are out there related to how to kind of get yourself started and up and functional, right? So there's a fantastic GitHub repo that's called Enterprise Scale. You could take that, copy it locally, and you could think about, literally just hitting AZ deploy or hitting deploy to Azure, whatever your flavor is to get something up and functional. So the Git repository is scoped at a customer AAD tenant for all Azure infrastructure. If you take a look at the innards, and I'll kind of show you some of that here later in the session, you'll start to see what we've done here, because I think a lot of what we're getting to is the idea that people want to be up and functional and fast. So there's a lot of great quick start templates, and this is kind of stemming off of that, the quick start template repo. It's giving you everything you need to be up and functional to embrace some of those quick starts, to be able to build out those VMs that become the point in which you can see your application live on an ongoing basis, right? One of the recommendations, though, that's always kind of rubs customers the wrong way, deploy it right now and discover it as is, right? It's probably not going to have everything you want. Maybe it might be too restrictive as well. But the idea here is it's hard to know what you don't have when you don't have something to deploy from. So the recommendation is just to take this, deploy it as is, poke around, become more familiar with what it's doing. And then, in theory, it might even open up your eyes to some of the ways in which you might think about using this for auditing storage endpoints, auditing tags, right? You want to think through how some of the policies and definitions get plugged in, just because of the fact that, especially if you're starting from scratch, this is an okay way to kind of cut your teeth, so to speak, in terms of having a landing zone. The ARM orchestrator kind of helps you declare that goal state in 4 scopes. You've got the tenant already figured out. You've got the management groups. You have your subscriptions figured out, as well as your resource groups. So this allows you to do that end-to-end orchestration to deploy, right? So this helps you build out a CI/CD pipeline where all you have to do is file new regions and landing zones, and you've got a brand new area that already has hybrid networking, hybrid identity. It's got all the policies that you're actually indicating you don't want people to go be building out M-series VMs without approval. You don't want to have folks just building out storage accounts that are publicly accessible, right? There's a lot of different things you can think through related to control. And this is where if having it all codified and ready to go and plugged into a CI/CD pipeline tool, that makes it so much easier to expand if you all of a sudden say, we're in West US and East US, now we want to also take advantage of, say, Central US, right? Then you're spread across 3 different regions all over America. Wouldn't it be so much more straightforward if you had all this codified and ready to go? It certainly would. So I think that's the big part here, the autonomous landing zones. You want to be able to enforce the policy by the platform. You want to have everything kind of come online, know what it's supposed to be doing, because it already is getting all the right details from the ways in which you connect networking and identity. It knows where it's supposed to be. It knows what it's supposed to do, so that when you bring that workload over to a new region or a new area, or maybe you have to think about moving and migrating, right? Because there's some regional issue. This helps out related to sustainability and resiliency and quick uptime. So if you align kind of yourself to match the Azure native tools, you'll see some of the business need kind of drive forward from that point, right? So that's why I think one of the recommendations is to build it out as is, because you may not know all the things you can do with Azure Policy out the gate. It's kind of a cool tool, and I still feel like I'm coming up to speed with it most times, like, oh, you can go and deploy that with Azure Policy. I didn't even think about that. So I think, building it all out that way, and I'll showcase the GitHub repo, it'll give you more confidence in what you're deploying and what you're building. When you think about configuration drift detection and reconciliation, people are still managing fleets of servers, and that's going to be kind of the standard norm for a while yet. You want to think through the ways in which to handle that configuration drift. You can lean on some of the, immutable configuration using the Git itself, right, coming from this repo. You can take this, a clone of this, and push it to your own CI/CD tooling, right? So there's a lot of flexibility here, and then this repo itself gets updated. I see something got updated 2 days ago. So people are in here and they're coming up with ways of how to make this more applicable to all these customers that we work with on a regular basis. So you can always take that clone, you could have a spot living somewhere, and that's just where you get the updates to the clone. And then you could figure out, does it make sense to plug everything in to what we already have existing? I mean, it's really up to you on how you want to make use of this. But the beauty is it's all there for you. You can just strip apart what you don't need. You can take off, or you can even bolt on certain things too, right? There's a number of ways of doing that. This really is inclusive regardless of roles. So, a lot of your devs won't be freaked out by a GitHub repository. What's still starting to be kind of a mixed bag is how your ops folks handle it, right? I often say, if I can do it, you can too. My background's very heavy in ops and infrastructure. I joke often that I feel more like an infrastructure developer these days. First, I haven't touched a physical server for over 5 years now at this point. So everything's shifting and evolving, and the beauty is taking this as is and starting to play around with it. It builds up that muscle. It makes you feel less anxious when you're looking at lines of code. So, the way in which that this whole repo is put together, there's a lot of great documentation. There's a README that guides you through the mix, as well as prescriptive guidance throughout the repo. And then this helps you build out that consistent export of all resources at all scopes across the tenant with implicit dependencies as well. So, everything I think gets to that point where you want to have an environment up and online and functional, so you can move workloads over to, or you can build new workloads, right? Having everything live in a codified world helps it out so much more, because you have capacity to bring something online what feels like instantaneously, where it might have taken months prior to, because you had to procure the hardware, procure the circuits, make sure that you had the right maintenance contract in place with whatever colo vendor you were using, et cetera, right? A lot of that's changed by the way of the cloud. So you're leaning on economies of scale here to help out what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So the different altitudes of content and guidance. So it's interesting, right? You think about your portfolio, that's really the overall collection of workloads, assets, and supporting resources. This will help you build out what the projects look like, what the people are going to look like related to how this builds on a day-to-day basis, or not builds, but how this functions on a day-to-day basis. You'll think through all the business processes as well. That kind of sits at the top. From there, you'll think about the distinct deployments of the cloud platform. This will help you govern multiple regions. This will help you figure out hybrid solutions or any multi-cloud scenarios. A number of customers now are really realizing they want multi-cloud as well as hybrid. So you can have your cake and you can eat it too. It just requires a little bit of planning and making sure you understand how those different platforms perform. What that then leads to is the landing zones. That's where you've got the functional services and features, kind of that shared plumbing, so to speak, which is required to support one or more workloads. So, the landing zones kind of come after you've gone through the assessment, gone through the planning, gone through all of the ways in which to think about how to build out these environments. Then you're building out the environments, right? And then the workload is like a collection of assets, right? So it could be applications, data, infrastructure itself that really comes together and supports a common business goal. Usually it's multiple servers, usually it's multiple types of servers. Maybe it's even, microservices, right? So we are at that age where developers are picking up these tools and building things fast. So you can even think through that, right? So if I brought up an environment that a developer was maintaining and building, how could I bring it online and make it be functional with the existing landing zones, right? So a lot of new fast ways of thinking, but I mean, the beauty is you're not starting from scratch if you lean on the landing zones that are sitting in the GitHub repo. The assets themselves, they're the smallest unit of technical function, right? These support kind of the workload or solution as it stands, and all of this is aligned to the cloud adoption framework. When you move over here to the right, you'll see that kind of, the strategy and plan, the govern, the ready, adopt, and manage. Gosh, that sounds familiar, right? That's everything we covered during the cloud adoption framework. Hopefully there are lights that kind of, go off, right? You're starting to see that we've gone through the cloud adoption framework, which takes into consideration the full strategy of getting you to the cloud. We've moved you now to the well-architected framework last week, where we talked about migrating specific workloads. Now it's coming time to actually move those workloads, so you need that landing zone. And then when you think about the workload specific, the well-architected will come into the mix here. And so all of this, in theory, plays well together, but I think each customer does tend to think about it a little bit differently. So, the beauty is Microsoft continually updates the documentation, continually adds new things to this GitHub repo I'll show you here shortly, and makes you feel like it's a little less of you have to start from scratch. So we'll talk a little bit about the resources and next steps. So Dwayne and I like this slide quite a bit. It actually talks about what we've talked about the last couple of weeks, right? Yep. Defining the strategy, which is the cloud adoption framework, planning, which is where you're taking a workload and you're planning how to make it all work, and then ready is the landing zone, right? And if you take a look at this actual slide itself, it's moving into adopt, which is migrate, and we'll talk about Azure Migrate next week. We'll also talk about operations evolution, and I think the next one is Azure Arc. So there's a lot of goodies that are coming up here that we'll be talking about, and they'll all pretty much feed into one another. It's not like we're introducing something crazy like machine learning or AI, right? So it's not to say those aren't cool, but you also need to make sure everything's functionally ready for those types of workloads, because they're very different workloads than the traditional IT, VMs, networks, et cetera, right? So, you want to make sure that this guidance that, we've talked about is brought into the mix. And if, you're stuck along the way. Microsoft has a lot of resources that can help you kind of keep moving. That's the whole goal, right? If you stall out your migration path, you start losing abilities to continue to move forward. Maybe by the time you start moving forward, you're 6 months behind where the cloud is, right? That's the hard part because the cloud is changing so quickly. So, that's why we've come up with these great guidelines, all of this good guidance. And the hope here is that it helps you plot out what you need to do. In terms of next steps, so these links here are direct links to our documentation. The first one brings you to the design principles, right? And then the second link takes you to the design guidelines themselves. And then the third link takes you to the reference implementation guide. So if you're familiar with Microsoft documentation, I could have bombarded you with about 100 different links. I always feel like that's kind of not the right method. It's death by 1,000 links, right? So I think the bigger bet here is to have you land on an overview page and realize that there's probably everything you need on the far right of whatever browser you're using, right? So it doesn't matter if you're on Mac or Windows or Linux. Documentation works like that, where you've got your overview at the top, you've got everything you're looking for on the far left, and then you can kind of pick and choose what you need to do. But these are essentially kind of the landing pages, so to speak. And the last link there is the GitHub repository. So I think what I'll do now, Dwayne, is I will show the GitHub repository.
Yes, why don't you show that? One thing we'll do is we'll put the links maybe in the comments section when we get this video up on YouTube, so that we have these links and the link that we referenced, or that you referenced earlier as well.
Yeah, and I didn't even think about that until I started going through it in my head, and I'm thinking, gosh, I missed that link. It is like the link I think I pass along most frequently with customers or people who are newer to cloud, especially if they're getting weird errors related to maybe regional constraints from a CPU perspective. Maybe they have a bunch of H series and they're getting a bunch of red text of death as they're playing around with PowerShell, or they're getting errors when they're trying to deploy ARM templates, right? Sometimes those are regional constraints related to vCPUs you can have for a specific class of VMs, right? So we'll definitely include that. I think it's really important. Mm-hmm. So the actual GitHub repository itself is underneath the Azure bucket. It's enterprise scale. Anything with a dot in front of it, especially if you're newer to source control, don't worry about. These are essentially ways of mapping this repo over time. So the thing that I wanted to start going into here is, say, docs, for instance, right? So these are all things that surround pictures and whatnot. So the files themselves aren't, or the folders aren't important, it's the files. But if you go into here, you see this nice written thing about enterprise scale architecture. This is directly coming from the documentation that we already have online, but you can clone this and it's less work for you. You can clone it, put it into your world, and then you've got these boiler templates that you didn't have prior to embracing this repo, right? You don't even have to copy and paste. It's all markdown format. So you get the design principles, the design guidelines, the critical design areas. These take you to our actual links online. I don't know if you can see when I hover over it, it's taking me to where all this exists. So that's kind of cool. You've got this is if you ever wanted to contribute. So a lot of customers get savvier and savvier with code and their work processes, so you can always contribute. This is the actual deployment of the landing zones. Notice how you can literally just click deploy to Azure and it'll go. That's kind of cool. This won't work for me, but it will pop out the portal browser itself. Let's go back. Oh man, there we go. So I went too far and it wouldn't let me go back without hitting it a bunch. So that's cool. You can see it's pretty straightforward. If you are curious as what the code looks like, you always have capacity to edit that template. It's not like you have to take it as is. You could copy and paste it and put it into your editor of choice. You could tinker around with it. It's pretty powerful. These are like the FAQs, right? So everything from why do enterprise scale ARM templates require permission at tenant root or scope? Walk you through that. This does get updated pretty regularly, so this would be something to pay attention to. The known issues. This was updated 15 days ago. It walks you through some of the things that they have to work on. This is a team of folks that are kind of maintaining and kind of upskilling the technical resources that you might be working with in the field. So these are the folks that are taking feedback from what they're seeing at customers and applying it into the landing zone itself. I did want to make sure that I spent some time and I showed you how, what it looks like when it's actually in locally, right? So enterprise scale, all these different folders. The docs are pretty important. This is where everything shows up. This is where you get the capacity to adjust and change. And if you're not familiar with VS Code, you can always preview it as well. And this kind of gives you a more readable format. I always feel like Markdown looks a little like 1980s text on like an older keyboard or an older computer or something. So
or a dot matrix printer.
Yes,
printout,
exactly,
like that,
exactly. Yeah. So if you want to see how this looks like over time, this is a great way to. I love the preview feature inside VS Code. If you're, I forget what extension it is, but if you hang out in the world of extensions, you might already have this installed. This is awesome. So you can author things, you can highlight specific links. This is the landing zone itself. So let's see. So let me close out of this preview, and then I will go into this preview. So this just gives you literally all of the pieces you would be looking for. Now, there's also code in here too. I have not gone into that yet. Let's go into, I think I want to go into the examples. So this is the Sandbox CAF Foundation. So let me shut these down here.
Yeah, a quick pointer. If it opens up in the preview folder or preview window, you can drag that tab over to the Markdown, and it'll swap out your preview.
Oh, that I didn't know.
VS Code trick that I've found.
Nice. I feel like, so I'm trying to build out a blog, and I'm going to start using probably a Hugo theme, and everything's Markdown. So I've learned a lot about what Markdown can and cannot do. It is not Word, but it is pretty darn powerful, and it's lightweight. So I think that's why a lot of these blog templates are using it now, like Hugo, Jekyll, etc.
The lightweight is definitely the reason.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't get tied down by large file sizes and things like that.
Right. So this is the actual file that deploys the foundation. So I'm going to actually go down here to the outline itself. And if you're not familiar with an ARM template, it's usually just parameters, variables, and resources. But you see here, it's talking about the organization name, the shared services. So we talked about that hub and spoke model. The shared services would probably be where your hub would go, where everything would terminate from a networking perspective. You probably place your domain controllers there. If you're bringing a management tool like Splunk into Azure, you may want to place it there. So this is why we say like shared services. So services that every business unit might take advantage of. You can think about that. But yeah, so these are just parameters that are declared. So key vault name, storage account name. Then the resources that get deployed here, let me expand this out a bit. It's a number of policy definitions, and it's actually it's all policy definitions.
So yeah, we have a bunch of policy definitions in here that are going to create then those policies for our landing zones, and what's going to govern that environment, and what resources and what services are going to be stood up within that. As the ARM template is going to define all of that, and define what policies and the base policies that our environment's going to govern in as we once we deploy this template.
Thank you. I get all choked up.
All choked up over ARM templates.
No, I think if you toy around with this and you play with it, what you'll come up with is the way in which to codify this. So that's what I wanted to talk through, and just make sure that everybody knows this is not like where you need to land with it. Like, you could always adjust and change. You could experiment. That's a big part of this journey, building those muscles, figuring out the right way to move forward. So it's really cool, though, that you're able to now take this from the GitHub repo, massage it, tweak it, and test it, and then plug it into your world. So you get documentation that sort of guides what these landing zones will look like. You get these predefined policies that you can tweak and adjust based upon what you're looking for. You could always remove these policies, right? This is not the way in which you have to, this just may or may not be your end state, is probably the better way of saying that. So you've got
it's giving you guidelines that you can then adapt to your own environment as necessary.
Right. So yeah, so that's essentially the kind of the landing zones or the enterprise scale landing zones in a nutshell. Let me stop sharing here.
All right. So that brings us to the end of this this topic. Hopefully everybody's has a little bit more comfort around landing zones. As we brought up, we now we're continuing on this path, and we hit the overall umbrella in our first episode on cloud adoption framework. We got a little bit more granular with the well-architected framework and building those architectures. Now we're starting to take that forward into now we're ready to start deploying, and landing zones are that first step to build and compartmentalize what we're going to put and build into our policies and our enterprise architecture, and the ability then to scale that architecture and adhere to the overall governance that we've built within our environment. Next week, we're going to be back and talk about how we can utilize then Azure Migrate to continue the readiness, and then move and start building and bringing our environment into Azure using the Azure Migrate tools and deploying these first landing zones and bringing on that. And then from there, then we start getting into that managing govern piece of the cloud adoption framework. So hopefully everybody has a really good foundational idea now around landing zones. We'll continue to talk again. Like I said, landing zones are a key piece to the Azure Migrate. So it'll come up again, as will cloud adoption framework and well-architected framework as we continue down this path.
Yes, and I will promise not to get choked up next time.
Yes, and I'll try not to as well. So I want to thank everybody.
We just feel so passionate about it,
yes,
right?
We're so passionate about the architecture, the architectural frameworks in Azure. We just can't help ourselves. So, and I hope everybody else feels that way as well. We thank you very much for attending this Thinking Cloudy episode on landing zones. My name's Dwayne Natwick.
I'm Shannon Kuehn.
And any of these episodes, you can find the previous episodes on skillmeup.com, as well as on our Skill Me Up YouTube channel. And any upcoming live episodes can be found on skillmeup.com, where you can register for a trial subscription or sign up for a subscription on Skill Me Up and see any of our live events as they take place. So thank you very much for attending, and till next week, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
All right, bye.